Beyond Light was our first taste at a new element in Destiny after 6 years. It was also a glimpse into the new subclass system known as Aspects and Fragments, which allowed Bungie to move away from the Diamond system that had been critically panned since the launch of the game. 3 years later, and a year of being nerfed constantly, and Stasis is now a Coldplay lyric of what it used to be. Stasis was essentially a trial and error of what subclasses would look like in the future with Aspects, Fragments, and Verbs. This, of course, was not accounting for the fact that these verbs would be completely overpowered when paired against not verbs. The error comes from the fact Stasis was blatantly overpowered in PvP when it launched. Yeah, it was strong in PvE, but it wasn't the steamroller. In fact, it was weaker in lower end content due to its lack of damage. So most of Beyond Light year was spent trying to balance the big kid new subclasses with the toddler subclasses. Now Bungie is afraid to touch Stasis with a 10-foot pole, because one slip up and it's back to PvP being Goomba stomping people to death. And now that Beyond Light is nearly 3 years old, it's unlikely they see investing into an element many new players might not touch as a priority. So brief tangent, I was procrastinating this video as I usually do, when Bungie released the patch notes for Season of the Deep for the mid-season, and they nerfed Stasis. Like, what? It's even more clear given that Strand, despite getting a nerf soon, has a stronger verb lineup than Stasis when it comes to crowd control. Strand has a damage dealing, crowd control, debuffing, and defensive verb, combined with the fact that all of its base abilities deal decent damage. Compare that to Stasis, being all in on crowd control, which holds back its PvE abilities, due to a lack of damage output and a lack of defensive options outside of a basic overshield. The verbs themselves can do with some tuning. In a mirror with Solar, Stasis builds up a debuff which at max stacks causes a reaction. In this case, slows will build up, freezing a target, and then you shatter it to deal damage. The problem is that slow doesn't do enough on its own in PvE to warrant its use. It's a stepping stone to freeze. Scorch is also a stepping stone to ignite, however it deals damage over time, which can at least stagger enemies and help speed up the killing process. Aspects themselves are showing their age. In terms of individual aspects, Warlocks and Titans have a pretty decent setup with a good set of crowd control and damage options. However, Hunters have aspects for close quarters that give very little benefits. Winter Shroud, for example, might be helpful in PvP when it first launched, but getting close to enemies to slow them with a dodge lacks the real power of an aspect. Shadow Dive, outside of funny movement tech, doesn't really have a place in builds, because why jump in the air and risk getting close to an enemy to shatter them when I can just shoot them with my gun. Hunter's best aspect is Touch of Winter, which is an aspect archetype of buff and grenades. Normally these aspects tend to carry the PvE abilities of a subclass for the general player base, such as Touch of Flame, Touch of Thunder, and Mindspend Invocation. This isn't the case with Stasis for one simple reason: the cooldowns. Stasis, in a mixture of an attempt to balance PvP and because crowd control is a powerful tool, has some of the longest ability cooldowns in the game. So while you can have a strong Stasis grenade, they lack the impact of other grenades due to dealing less damage and having longer cooldowns. Let's also not forget one of the biggest things holding Stasis back: Harvest aspects. Every other element has access to the elemental pickups with the use of fragments at most, or even innately, like having the subclass equipped with Strand. Not for good old Stasis! Instead, you have to equip another aspect to generate Stasis shards, which grant melee energy. Something that in most cases isn't the most useful thing to have in a short cooldown. Now, there is one light aspect that does something similar: Electrostatic Mind. But the difference is, you make a fuckload of Ionic Traces, and also, Ionic Traces are extremely helpful because they grant all ability energy. They also don't have a cooldown like Stasis, so therefore you can make more of them and keep an ability cycle going. They're not held back by the fact that they have a long cooldown and you're waiting every few intervals to create Stasis shards. So quick revision to that last one. I also forgot that Electrostatic Mind gives you Amplified when you pick up an Ionic Trace, so it does more than just the Harvest aspects. This isn't super necessary in my explanation of why Stasis shards are ass, but it's just more fuel to the fire. However, you want them for most Stasis builds because there are 3 fragments dedicated to picking up Stasis shards, 2 of which would grant some well-needed survivability to Stasis, at least they used to. This is compared to every other element, which has only 1 fragment at most dedicated to elemental pickups, some of which grant the same effect as Stasis shards or even higher. So as a result, many Stasis builds force you to pick up 1 fun aspect and then 1 harvest aspect so you can have some sense of a build. Abilities are also a sore spot for Stasis, namely in terms of melees. Penumbral Blast is useful at crowd control, however Shiver Strike and Withering Blade do not hold up. Shiver Strike is this strange off-brand shoulder charge that was designed for shattering crystals in a 2 ability use system, which is similar to Shatter Dive, feels like it's too much of an investment for too little of a payout. Withering Blade struggles from the fact that slow is a weak verb and it also takes forever to get back in the first place. It's got some uses for fast reloading your weapons, however its cooldown, low damage, weak debuff make it all an underwhelming melee. Supers are also weak as, once again, they're tied back to abilities being weak as they're for crowd control. Winter's Wrath especially feels weak due to having 2 different button presses in order to deal damage. It's a niche super that really shines when it can lock down high level targets like in Grandmasters. However, outside of that, it feels like a crappy roaming super. I'd rather use Daybreak, Nova Warp, or Storm Trance just to crowd control better where I could just kill everything. Silent and Squall, despite being a one and done super, lacks the damage to really make it helpful in content, and as a result, it's a one and done super that feels designed for ad clear. A very contradictory super because usually you'd want something that ticks over time to be used during DPS, such as the case with... I generally forgot. Gathering Storm. The only super that has some notoriety to it is, ironically, the reskin of Fist of Havoc, Glacial Quake. And the reason for that is because it does a crapload of damage when you smash the crystals. I'll give one thing to Behemoth Titan, it does do some decent damage. Mainly due to the fact that shatter damage is pretty decent in certain scenarios. Yeah, it's not the most intuitive super, but I'll give it credit for at least being able to do some damage and still ad clear. So to recap, Stasis subclasses struggle due to a lack of damage in their abilities alongside long cooldowns and a lack of strength in their debuffs, and an outdated aspect that is required for a majority of build crafting. I think in order for Stasis to really start to improve, cooldowns on abilities need to be reduced, and certain abilities such as melees and supers need to output more damage. If Strand is able to have good CC and damage, Stasis can also have some damaging abilities. Slow needs to be more impactful in PvE. If I were to suggest something off the top of my head, either slow slows down enemy fire rate, or even lowers their accuracy when it comes to having slow. Note, this is namely in PvE. PvP slow is perfectly fine. Lastly, harvest aspects need to be removed from the game and made passive parts of the subclasses. There's no reasons why Arc 3.0 and Brood Reaver can have passives such as getting amplified off of arc kills or having Threadling's Perch, and Stasis is still stuck using aspects in order to get their elemental pickups. The specifics of harvest aspects can be translated to passives of the specific subclasses, rewarding the player for playing within the subclass's strengths. And if you're worried about hunters losing a fragment slot, just give an additional one to Winter Shroud or Shatter Dive, since as it stands they provide very little benefit without another ability. I know old content tends to not be touched after a year in the spotlight, but Stasis is more than old content. It's an entire power and should be balanced as such. The lid has been lifted off of Pandora's box, and Destiny's now a game with 5 elements. Stasis should receive more than just a paragraph of buffs every season. Given the nerf coming to Suspend, it's possible Stasis comes back into the spotlight for crowd control. But as it currently stands, even with that nerf to Strand, Stasis will not be able to stand on its own if it continues to be given minuscule buffs, or absurd nerfs like what happened to Whisper of Rhyme. If Stasis is supposed to be the king of crowd control, it needs to have the strength it deserves to have that title.
Strike.
I will. I will kill my and end up.
You missed! Oh my god!
Give me the fucking ball. Do not give Carl the nuts. That man is not gay.
That was the worst.
Has 0 ball handling skills.